Welcome. I think it's the first KASK lecture this year. Normally Godard would introduce this lecture, but I'm doing it for now. This KASK lecture today is a collaboration with Kiosk, and that's why it's not a big deal for me to do this presentation. Anyway, we have tonight Christoph Meier, who is the artist exhibiting in Kiosk at the moment. The show opened, I believe, 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks, I don't remember. 22nd. Yes, good, thank you. And in the context of the exhibition, which was made in collaboration with the Kunstverein in Hamburg and also with Casino Luxembourg, we also made a publication, and we thought that the launch of the second edition, the second variation of the publication, which is made in the context of the show here, would be a good moment actually to invite the artist for a talk, a discussion. And we invited as well Nadine Drost, the curator from Hamburg, who has also seen, who knows actually apparently Christoph already since a long time, and so know his work very well, has also seen the project in Hamburg, and we thought it was she was a good sparring partner to discuss with Christoph. I think the realization, maybe his work, his practice, but more specifically the realization of the project, the exhibition that's on view here. So later on, after this talk, which will take I think about an hour, max, maybe less, maybe more, we don't know, we'll see how it goes. We will have a small presentation of the book in Kiosk, so the show will still be open, so I would warmly invite you to come and join us for this event or this after event, and with some, let's say, I think there is a drink even provided. I hope so, and if not, there is always the mezcal, which we will talk about later probably. And I think this is also still an opportunity to, if there's things you want to tell or ask the artist, he will be around, so there is also the opportunity to chat with him afterwards. I think I will leave it for now and just leave the floor to you both. Thank you for taking the invitation. You want Q&A afterwards? Do you accept it? Or yes. So if there are questions at the end, we will have some time for them. Okay, thank you.
Wim, thanks so much, and also thanks so much for the invitation. So we thought it's also possible to pose questions during the talk, so if there are any, don't hesitate to ask us. And for sure afterwards we are here and we are in the exhibition space to answer questions, exactly. So first of all, I would like to tell you a little bit how we structured the talk. There are 3 topics Christoph Works is dealing with, and we wanted to talk about, first of all, installation and the meaning of installation in Christoph Works. The second part will be the question of container and what that contains in his context. And the third question we are raising is the one of social form. What does that mean in Christoph Works? So first of all, at the beginning I would like to talk about a work which is quite present also here in Kiosk, the exhibition space, and strongly defining the space, and in my opinion challenging the question of installation. And this work is made out of bamboo sticks forming a grid structure. What I first would like to know, we see that here a little bit, so we have some pictures in between to give you a visual image of that. So what I first would like to know is, Christoph, where does this structure derive from?
Hello, good evening. If you guys can't hear me, you better let me know, because these bamboo structures were coming from one exhibition I did very not very long time ago, but a couple of years ago, it was an exhibition which was called Soft Architecture, and it was a bit about showing nothing. It was in the Hochschule Bildender Kunst in Braunschweig, and for that exhibition I was asked to occupy the whole space, and the second artist was asked to only cover walls around, and but the challenge was to fill basically the space fully. And I started ordering, let's say, the most simple structures or the most simple elements, what you could call architecture, on Amazon, which is these party tents. And I transformed them slightly by not covering, by not applying the cover, by removing the what you know as the ceiling structure, and then I had the need to produce like a certain number of sculptures, as I call it, connectors basically, that would connect these various tents with each other, or these various huts or basic elements of architecture. And yeah, that was the beginning, and since then I carry around this thing, and it never really adapts, it just slightly adapts, it ignores a bit the existing space, and it's always functioning a bit as a shadow of the previous shows.
But in this case, when you're using this bamboo sticks, in Braunschweig, it was made out of plastic, as these party tents usually are in their structure. This time you're using bamboo sticks. So why do you do that?
Sorry, I should show it.
Yeah, that would be nice.
It was this.
This was at HGB Braunschweig.
Exactly, yeah. Sorry, but I didn't get the question. What I wanted to say again is like what you can see is the white metal bars are basically these tents just partly installed, and the knots, the connections are those elements that I had to throw in as a, let's say, creative outcome out of my practice to make this endless copy-paste version of this, let's say, not functioning exhibition display, or let's say an exhibition display or something similar that emancipated itself from being functional or so. Yeah, that's what it became. And later, through a project that I did with the artist Nicola Pecoraro,
there the bamboo sticks are.
exactly, came this project. It was a version of, it was actually based on an invitation in a foundry in Milano, where we were asked to produce sculptures on site and then have an exhibition in their abandoned office and workshop spaces. And what we decided to do is, like, we would make these connectors out of bronze, but in a, let's say, very archaic and handily made version, and we would connect it with bamboo, something which, you know these scaffoldings from China, they still work, they are still made out of bamboo, and they still build skyscrapers with it, but also it's like this completely, a very primitive organic material, a plant that just keeps growing like a line, let's say the most straight and cheapest at the same time wood that you could get somewhere. And in the foundry we were kind of always talking to these technicians and to the founders, or I don't know how to call them, and they were super surprised, because for them it made completely sense, because back in the day they used, instead of wax channels in the process of casting, they used bamboo, or to be precisely reed bars as the channels, and so for them it was like basically a version of what they did, an installation of what they did.
So in a way, this comes also from a sculptural context. How to build a sculpture was very important when using these bamboo sticks. But at the same time, you're also coming from an architectural idea, how you implement them into space. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I would say so.
No, because I found that quite interesting. This question of architecture appears in your work quite often, but in this sense, or in this specific installation shown here at Kiosk and also shown at Kunstverein, it's, in my opinion, more a question about installation. So where's the limit of an installation? Because this is not only an installation put in space, it is breaking through walls, going through windows. In other contexts, is going into toilets or into the offices. Yeah? So what's your idea? I mean, not only dealing with the question of this grid as installation, but fitting it into space, also going against that space in a way.
It is a bit of a limbo of both. I know that people that come and see the show, they look at it and they think it's an ignorant, primitive piece that is just, making its way through existing spaces, no matter what function they would have. But in the end, my job is to push these grids back and forth before I do the show on the floor plan. And whenever you find yourself solving one corner, suddenly you have, and you push it more to the left, suddenly you have a problem on the other side. So it's a very, let's say, two-dimensional work in that sense, and then of course it's also working, with its own, with the limitation of its own making. It's on the one hand it's the architecture that is always very dominant in exhibition spaces, and I'm kind of into the fact that it is so dominant and that it is basically a bit as a hidden and even more critical curator that gives you limitations when you show that. But then on the other hand, I also appreciate very much this discourse or this conversation that comes out of the fact that I bring this piece, which is mostly too big for the spaces, and then I start, I'm dropped into a discussion with the institution, and some institutions are, they seem to be cool, but they are totally unflexible, and others seem to be very, very open-minded, very stiff because of, let's say, their space, but they would act completely different, they're very flexible.
So you're also measuring out what's possible in a way in different situations.
Yes.
But at the same time, in this case, it's also very interesting how where do you see the difference in erecting on the space in Hamburg and now here in Kiosk? This is in a way the same system you're coming up with, but then you're working with that completely different in space. Could you describe that a bit further? For instance, here you're going through the window. In Hamburg, you were going into a toilet. At which point do you decide which spaces or at which point do you want to extend the existing exhibition space?
In Hamburg, it was that is the images of the show in Hamburg as it showed before, so you can also have an idea of how the show completely transformed just from his visual aspect. In Hamburg, they removed a wall between the downstairs exhibition space and what they called before the foyer. So basically, they removed that border, which I considered as, let's say, that line that you have to pass to, where people change their behavings in the foyer. They do other things than in the exhibition space. There was a different sound level. How people react when they go to shows. They have their own patterns, and they removed that border. And so I immediately thought, okay, so they can't stop me from also reaching into the foyer. And I wanted to pick up almost the visitors outside in the foyer and pull them kind of in. And that is always mostly the big difference. In Hamburg, you would enter and you would see at least, let's say, 80% of the whole work. In Kiosk, you would enter and you would see, on the first view, you would only see, let's say, 5%. So you would enter a bit through the back door, and that is mostly the difference. That anyway, it is a piece that can never be seen in its total appearance, in its entity, or how do you call it, eternity, and it's also disappearing into spaces that are obviously not meant to be exhibition spaces, or let's say that haven't been offered to me as exhibition spaces, and that work is a bit like a key where I open other spaces and expand into bathrooms and storages and archives and all these kind of places. And there I again do exhibition install shots, and suddenly the let's say the install shots, like this classic, let's say, genre of installation shots, are disturbed by images like these ones.
I see. So, because I find it so interesting in which kind of spaces the bamboo grid is entering, which kind of surrounding of the exhibition space it includes suddenly. So that, I mean, through the grid you're entering into the outside of the exhibition frame in a way. That's what I like a lot about that work in a way. So yeah, here we have it where it enters through the glass and goes to the garden, which you see when you're entering the kiosk. So what I found interesting about that, I mean, this idea that for sure it's put up by institutional critique, that the white cube is not neutral in any sense, that it's totally socially determined, and I see that question in your work. Would you like to talk about that a little bit further?
Yeah, if you want.
Yes, please.
For me, the institution is not primarily like a space where I'm put inside, or where I'm asked to expand my practice inside. It's far more. It's of course it's the offices, and it's it's all these, it's all the space, the infrastructures, the workshops around. That without those, the institutions would somehow like not exist. And if a person that runs an exhibition space, or an artist that works in an exhibition space, or even a viewer that is in an exhibition space, leaves that space and goes to a workshop, I don't think that these people stop thinking or talking or discussing the topics that they just did deal with in the exhibition space. They also do that behind these doors normally. I mean, we also talk about that exhibition here now. I think that's also a bit of an appendix. There's all this discussion about the educational departments in institutions. They also expand to other rooms. Let's say the exhibition, the institution. Just interrupt me if I'm talking nonsense.
No, it's not nonsense. I just wanted to define. I mean, this, when you have a talk or educational program around an exhibition, it's, in my opinion, something completely different than including or extending the exhibition space in itself, because this is still part of an aesthetic experience in a way. So there's a difference, in my opinion.
Yeah, of course, but there can be also a lot of aesthetic experience in an educational program. Don't you think? In many well, isn't this beautiful? In many let's say, in many of those layers, these questions are not dealt with. But I expand my exhibition to the garden, and I wouldn't, I don't treat the garden differently, or I don't treat my artwork in the garden differently than as I would do it inside. Yeah.
That's true, but at the same time you are expanding the exhibition space you're creating a different view on that one.
Yeah.
That's something I find quite interesting.
Once there was this architect, Wolf Brix, who is one of the Himmelblau architects. He said he lives in a flat, and he doesn't only live in that flat, he also lives in that house where that flat is, and not only there, but also in the street where the house, where the flat is, and in the city where that street is, where that house is, where his flat is. And I think an exhibition space with everything around it is quite the same.
I wouldn't say that it's the same because that's exactly that's exactly what you're doing with your work. You're thematizing. You're putting the finger on the wall, separating the inner space and the outer space by combining it. I think that's a very important thing in your work. Yeah? What I find interesting about the grid is it's creating an outer space, and this I totally agree. But at the same time, it's more, in my opinion, focusing on the question what the exhibition space is saying, how it is socially determined, how it's limited by the given space, and so on.
I often consider an exhibition space something like, or let's say this expectation from an artist. You come to an exhibition space, you unfold your practice, you open your heart, you show off or whatever, but you are always kind of asked to fill the space somehow. So I also consider the exhibition space almost a bit like as a container where I'm asked to fill, and if the architecture is definitely always an influencing aspect on that. On that outcome, either you have to show a lot or you're not a lot, or you shouldn't rather show anything as a reaction, not to lose or if you want to win against it. But if I'm drawing a line around that space where I'm asked to unfold or to work inside, by drawing that line, I also draw the line of the outside, the border, which is the space, the border of the space outside. And by just, every now and then stepping over, I guess I'm just making that border also a bit more visible.
Exactly, I totally agree on that. Yeah. Another thing, but I would like to talk about that as well. Oh no, there was just one more question. Because you're saying it should be a container, and you're asked to fill it. Yeah, this is a very specific way of filling it, because it's. There's not this massive material putting into your space. It's really defining it by lines, giving it that. Giving that grid into a space is. It's completely different to other works we're going to talk about. So it leaves much of air in a way, and space in between. It's more like a structure defining that space.
Yeah, some people say it's quite a complicated way how to show emptiness. Yeah. Of course that's true, but for me it's not empty. For me it's full. I fulfilled basically all what I could do with these fulfilling that expectations that a space should be filled. Of course, we can talk about how it's done, but this act is basically done. And if you know these, if you start layouting a book, for example, you always use a so-called blind text. In German it's called Blindtext. I'm not sure if it's the same in English. But you use a random text and you place it there, and then it's already full. That it's a bit a similar question for me. What I would never do is, what at least I found not yet a comfortable way, is to place another work inside of that work, which is, it would be a bit like these Russian puppets, but that work sits there and it wouldn't move, and that it expanded like quite ignorant into all these directions, it looks as if it's site specific, but at the same time it's not at all, because it doesn't give a shit. And but in the end, and some people say like, well, it looks as if it's dropped from moon, but in the end I worked like hours on finding the right spot. So it's this constant limbo between being full or being completely empty, between being site-specific or the total opposite.
But at the same time, it's going into the walls. It's not dropped or falling down into the exhibition space. So it's including the given exhibition space by actually, I think, at some points a root gesture going through the walls, anchoring that installation into that space. So do you also think that it's, I don't know, that it's rude or maybe ignorant how you're treating the given space?
No, not at all, because in a space like at Kiosk, with its history, with the fact that even the view outside is protected, that the glass is old and it has to stay old. In that setting, most people would say it's rude. If that place would not be in Ghent, but it would be, for example, in Portland, and if it would be out of plasterboard walls, but if it would be still an institution, let's say, of the same intellectual outcome or whatever, they wouldn't consider it as rude at all, because they have a different approach towards architecture, and it's embedded in the American, way of life, that you build your hut, and next year maybe there's a tornado that turns it down, and then you build your hut again. So the word rude fits here, but in other places it's the total opposite.
Yeah, but what I mean is not only how is the institution itself is reacting on the structure and how much is possible for you as an artist working on that. Actually, I was reading in the also today released catalog the text by Vanessa Joan Müller, and she's writing in the end the display system, and she's meaning the grid merely encounters a different system, enters into a relationship with it, responds to what exists in a non-constructive dialogue, however, in an almost provocatively aired disinterest. So that was something I found quite interesting. On one hand, how she's describing that, but this idea of disinterest, I can describe a bit further from my perspective. But I also like that regarding this grid installation. But would you underwrite the idea that it, let's say, behaves disinterested?
Yeah, of course. I know that it looks like this, but on the other hand, not. Yeah, it's the same. Like, you can read it as rude, but you can also read it that it has, a total freedom from its given surroundings.
This was actually something I was thinking of, because I was a bit hanging with this word disinterest, which is coming from Immanuel Kant. In German it's Interessenlosigkeit, and it was something which was, as you probably know, in art history totally attacked, and especially Pierre Bourdieu attacked Kant for his aesthetic theory, because he saw, and Pierre Bourdieu influenced the institutional critique a lot, so he radically attacked Kant's aesthetic theory based on the notion of disinterest, saying, and I quote again, "The pure aesthetic is rooted in an ethics, or rather an ethos of elective distance from the necessities of the natural and social world, and takes the bourgeois denial of the social world to its limits." So that means that the disinterest is actually an impression of the bourgeois power. So you just are able to having this interest aesthetic experience when you're having the intellectual or material capital. So the today aesthetic experience is taking that from a completely different side, and this is something where I'm coming from, and so I was interested following that thought. The actual aesthetic theory is saying but you ignore the fact that art serving the representation of a privileged social class is by no means indifferent. So starting from that point of view, the meaning of this interest changes completely, and it could include in some way a radical openness. So, and transferring that thoughts in a way back to your work, I was a little bit wondering these words Vanessa Joan Müller was writing provocatively, the disinterest. Is it actually much more than a radical openness which is pronounced in that?
Yeah, for me it is totally an open system, and it is an invitation almost, like to walk inside. You know, it's a bit, for me it's also, you know, a quite weird feeling to be inside of an artwork. I mean, if we write this down, or if we read this, to be in an artwork or to be next to an artwork, there's a certain poetry in that. And yeah, for me, it's obviously this openness is part of it. It's a bit like, let's say, a structure that imitates the primitive elements that, you know, like really, in German there's this word Urhütte, which is like, let's say, the first hut. So this work has like similar aspects and maybe associating similar aspects. It associates, it allows associations with, let's say, fair architecture or market architecture, something, you know, that you build up every day, and then you move forward, and then you build it up again, and then you dismantle it. So yeah, again, it might look rude and disrespect the existing space, but it's an open thing that travels further to the next show, their functions a bit like as a footprint or as a shadow of the previous one, and comes to a completely different outcome. You know, maybe in the next show, because the space in Casino, for example, is far bigger, maybe there's no need for me to drill through existing walls, and it would be just freestanding, and then it would be, you know, these associations of, let's say, it's rude, or it's ignorant, or it's going to the outside, it's enlarging, or it's extending the exhibition space. Maybe these questions are just not erased, but still people can stay inside and walk inside and be inside.
So there's in a way a double openness, because for you it is an open structure for sure. You can extend and adapt to specific spaces. At the same time, you're giving this idea of openness back to the viewer in a way. Could you say it like this?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Maybe we continue. We talked a lot about these grid structures. Well, there aren't any questions about that right now. So now I'm a bit curious, talking about the containers. Do we have a container as an image?
Well, this is also a container. These are the classic containers, we could say, in the exhibition.
So they are all untitled, is that right? Lots of works of yours are untitled, yeah?
Yeah, I'm a very bad titler.
And what's the idea behind that works? Could you describe it a bit?
They're a bit like condensations of, let's say, the other work, or how do you call this, substrat of the bamboo. They're like, let's say, for me they're very precisely, they can be precisely described, let's say, in a language like mathematics, for example. You can give a precise definition of how big and these things, how big it is, and so they're not any, you know, they are totally in the tradition of minimalism, let's say. But then I wanted to create works that not only work in terms of surface, but also showing a bit their inside. I did once a series of works in a gallery in Berlin. I should show you. They look like this. And again, there I was strongly influenced by the architecture. It is, let's say, one of the few spaces of a gallery where you would always enter from that side and you would always look at artworks, but in the end you also always look out of the window. And it felt for me a bit like the concrete version of the Earth Room by Walter de Maria. And I thought I want to work with the fact that there's always light coming from the backside and that there's always a view towards the outside. So I created these baskets or containers that worked with perforated metal sheets with two similar patterns or identical patterns, and so they created the so-called Mouret effect. So people started looking at the Mouret effect while looking at the sculptures. In that sense, they stopped looking at the sculpture because they looked at the Mouret effect. I mean, it's a bit like you close your eyes a bit and then you follow the Mouret, and by that you stop looking at the sculpture. And these works that I show here in Kiosk, they come out of that series of works, let's say sculptures that have a lot of painterly aspect, like a lot of painting aspects, and that they, let's say, try to impress with their inner sides. In this show, I did for the very first time. I filled them with material. I played to come to a certain composition. I played with, similar to the other works, with perforation and, let's say, not finished perforation, and then I welded them and I closed them. So for me they are now a bit like prisons of various materials that are part of my practice, basically.
So in a way, I remember this, what Duchamp once said. He was asked in an interview how he chooses his ready-mades, and he answered, "It chooses you, so to speak." So could you adapt that on your what you put into the containers? How, I mean, is that material that finds you, or what does it mean? It's part of your practice exactly.
Let's say I try to keep a very ironic way of for myself, otherwise I would get bored. An ironic way of how to understand my position or my job decision or whatever, like how I understand my role as an artist. And by that, in a very early state, I decided I want to never have a good idea, or like I would never have to, and would never like to do a work which is strongly fed by an idea. Obviously that doesn't work. I mean, I also have ideas, but in terms of material and in terms of sculpture, I often find myself in front of a material and then it says like, do this with me. I never search, I never make a sketch, and I never search for something that would fulfill some ideas that I had in advance. It's in that sense, it's in the Duchampian tradition.
Mm-hmm. And part of the series is also another work, which is built around a heat exchanger. Do we have a picture of that one as well? So a heat exchanger is a device to transfer solid objects into fluid, or to exchange these different materials. And this heat exchanger itself appears also from time to time in your practice. Yeah, is that right?
Yeah, I mentioned minimalism before. Let's say I'm a child of minimalism. That's the stuff I was studying a lot, and I like the fact that I also mentioned mathematics before, and I also mentioned the aspect of, let's say, the language aspect of mathematics. that it's a language that is very precise on things, or can be very precise on things. And I'm mostly driven by, let's say, basic abstract forms, so cylinders, squares, all these kind of standards. They give me good reasons, so to say. And these heat exchangers, they are basically the same thing, like a sponge. They are something that, they are an object which has at the same time the least volume as possible by having at the same time the biggest surface you can have. That's basically the characteristics of a sponge. And so you can say that a sponge is something that comes at the very end if you talk about surfaces. Mm-hmm. It's the last one before it becomes a volume. Mm-hmm. So it's something that is it's at the very end of two-dimensional, almost jumping over to three-dimensional. And I started using these sponges or these heat exchangers as sponges, so to say. Every now and then I build casts or molds in the studio, and I fill it with plaster or concrete or all kind of various materials, like these containers. As you can see, the mold is in the end the container, and I fill it. But what I do is I remove one of the walls of these molds, and let's say I build in a trap, something that makes the plaster, the liquid, run out and make an almost slapstick, idiotic mess, and it runs over my shoes, and then I have to hurry, and when I have to hurry, there's no time to make decisions about certain, about certain things. You're gonna hurry, and so it's a bit like a handicapped version of a container, of a precise container compared with the others in the show. And these sponges are obviously then stuck to these objects that I actually wanted to do, these white ones, for example.
And it's also about the question, the difficulty of finding the form, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
Do you want to go a bit further on the containers, or shall we switch to another untitled work?
We can do that. Yeah, we can do that. We spoke about these here. By the way, that one is my personal homage on my first show at Kiosk in 2009, which was still in the glass pavilion. It's basically, let's say, the dehydrated, condensed version of what that show back in the day was, which I shouldn't now just talk, but also show you. It looked like this. It was basically, again, I understood the space a bit like as something I should fill, and somehow now looking at these things, I see more and more these bamboo and grit works. It was just on a very, let's say, more flexible way. Maybe I was a bit more flexible back in the day, but in the end it was just bars, and people could grab one of these bars, and they had different kind of colors, and they had different kind of neon tubes stuck into the top, and then people started running around and walking around with them, more or less fragile, of course. And the whole thing was back in the day I called the exhibition Proposal for a Discotheque, and which gives maybe now a good line over to the last works.
Yeah, because I was a bit kidding. It's actually not really untitled. It's called Untitled, and in brackets Discotheque.
Exactly. I already said that I'm not a good titler. Yeah, it's these works here.
This work. And this, as we see, exists of aluminium plates positioned on a portable work system, and the aluminium plates are marked by 2 letters punched on the surface. So we have the C's and O's there, Where do the letters come from? That's something I'm interested in.
I already spoke about these perforated metal sheets, about these containers that created the Meier effect. And I thought that was one of my best, and at the same time it was also worse or bad that I had that idea. I wanted to create objects that, that led to be not seen, or that people didn't look at because they created that Meier effect. Similar like a mirror in an exhibition. If you put a mirror in the exhibition, people start looking at themselves, for example. I also know something that I'm fascinated by. And so I wanted to create again various versions of containers, and I wanted to stick to that method that you perforate, or that you take a sheet which is already perforated, and in that sense, or in these works, I thought I need a certain source I could use to create a perforation pattern, and I used a text which was written on an occasion of an exhibition in the Vienna Secession, and that text was called Social Forms. And I think I was mentioned twice, once in the headline and once at the very end. And I considered it as a really beautiful moment that somebody, takes the occasion to fill an empty page of art history, writing about social forms and the post-Fordist aspects in my work. And I hardly understood half of the text, and I was just the reason this text happened. So I considered even the text itself, or let's say that catalogue of my exhibition, as a social form, because the person, Christoph, who wrote that text, and then there was my person who, was the occasion, and then there was the secession, etc. So a few years later, Christoph, who is now the boss of the Kunstwerk in Berlin, he had a completely critical eye on this text, because he thought it is quite mean or rude that somebody would write a text on the occasion of an exhibition of an artist and doesn't mention that artist. And through a nomination process, he produced he produced a version of the text which contained of an image, it contained of an interview with Christoph Bruckner, a transcription of this interview, and then he packed everything into an email and called it, in the subject line, he called it one text. And he quickly wrote something like what my work would be about, and that I should only always use this one text and reuse it and reuse it and reuse it again. And I thought that's a bad idea, and I never did it till this showed up. And I thought, well, that's the perfect moment where I actually could reuse that text material. And I erased everything from the text which wasn't a C or an O, and then I laser cut it out of these 8 pages of aluminium, and after that I folded these pages to, let's say, kind of get close to what these containers, or what like basic boxes or baskets could look like. But I wanted to stay, let's say, a bit looser, let's say, making containers that unfold and become stages or tables or functional furniture. And the C and the O's I just had I used as holes to be able to plug them together with these corks and to attach them to the structures below, and to also have like the opportunity for people to put their fingers inside and stick a piece out, and to be precisely an O is a hole, and a C is something like let's say a drawing of a hole.
Yeah. And that's also where the title of the show derives from, CO, so
Yes.
Coco.
Yes. And then somehow for me the O becomes a hole, and if it's a hole, it's also somehow again a container, something where you can put something inside.
Which, by the way, is actually really funny, saying that there should exist only one text for your artistic work. I think it's really strange in a way, but nevertheless, and so far, I understand this idea that it should be transformed in a way. This also being making as a gesture that there should be, for sure, exist much more text and more different perspectives on a work.
I mean, I also thought so. I would close completely my practice towards the outside, which is totally not my way to be, and that would be exactly the opposite. The last thing what I should do, but in the end, I kind of followed his advice to use the text somehow again. Maybe I will one day also use his email or the picture he did of. We talk about this material.
Let's take a look at that if you have it there.
So that was an exhibition, and he nominated me for that exhibition, and it was a prize exhibition, and there was like one winner who takes it all, and the others were just crying. And with that nomination text that he made out of this text that Christoph Buchner wrote before, obviously it was clear that I will never get this prize. So he asked me to send him the pages of that text. You see Christoph Buchner there, and the headline social forms, and then he glued it to his desk, started making notes, and then he scanned these pages and sent it to me together with this photo of his desk. On the left side you see the email, and on the right side a transcription of this interview that he made with Buchner, and that was a bit like David against Goliath, or somebody that is a fish fighting against somebody that is an animal or so. They were completely the opposite in terms of persons, and that was basically a redigestion of Buchner's material in a Kreuthhusian way, and
But actually, that they had that conversation is some point you were coming from. So it's not necessary when you're as a viewer in front of a work to know the story, but for you it's important that you had this translation process.
Yes, yes. I found a bit. Sorry, I found a bit copied also in the. Christ obviously understood how I work, or how I often work, and he repeated that.
And then he gave you the platform to continue.
Yeah.
Okay.
But he wasn't guiding me, he was a bit using me, and that was what I was a bit confused in the beginning.
But at the same time, it was not only the CNOs you, in a way, took out of the text, also the question of social form appears in that work, in my opinion, in this critique, because in a way it's possible to interact with the work. You can, as you already said, pull your fingers into the metal plates, pull out the C's and the O's, and it's also possible to have this a drink of what it's called, mezcal,
yes.
Mezcal, a Mexican liquor. So could you go a bit further on your idea of giving a work that gives a possibility to interact with, or is it social in any sense? What does that mean for you?
As I described before, these works where you would look basically out of the window while you look at the work, or where you would stare at the work and you wouldn't look at the work itself, but at a certain effect that work would produce. This is a similar approach. It is a work that, let's say, gives you various ways to interact. It doesn't tell you to interact. I don't want to put up signs saying like, please put all your fingers into these tables and get like a weird, choreography or a yoga move. I rather place these works and let them, be triggers of in an exhibition space of possible and various ways to interact. When I serve alcohol in an exhibition, for me it comes out of a series of works and series of bars that I did before, but in the end, what learned me these projects was that if you serve alcohol while somebody looks at your art, you're kind of like having also your fingers in the perception somehow. And not in a negative way, rather in a positive way. Let's say I rather try to get viewers being positively with my work. But I see a certain beauty in the fact that you can go to an exhibition, you stand in front of a sculpture, you can put your finger into the sculpture and then you drink a bit of the sculpture. And then you go home and the sculpture goes with you in a certain bit. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's a bit like this. I mean, it is a liquid material. Could also work with water, obviously, but it's a bit.
Could it?
I also did works with water. But yeah, I see a certain beauty that a sculpture becomes almost a functioning form of people gathering around and maybe also forgetting about their, these patterns we are in when we go to exhibition spaces or when we go to supermarkets or when we sit at talks or when we do talks. And I'm always, I'm kind of like fascinated by the fact that you can open an exhibition space by drilling through the wall, and then you go to the garden and you continue there, and by then you free the work somehow. And it's a similar way. It's suddenly people, behave different when they gather around the sculpture, have a drink, put their fingers in holes, or put sculptures differently together. And yeah, it's that certain openness, I guess, which you mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah, I agree on that because I see it also more as a maybe a comment on social form, because in my opinion it's not social in itself, the work. It's more about focusing or systematizing conventions and behavior within behavior in an art space. And I mean, it's not thought to create a real social interaction in that sense, or it's not thought to be a social interstice, as Nicolas Bourriot called art. Or he also said that art should inhabit the art should the reason to inhabit the world in a better way. So he saw, Bourriot saw the meaning of art and the way how it works in creating a better world. So I don't see that intention, this idea of social in that work. And for me, it's actually, and I totally agree on that, much more on the idea of how can I behave in an exhibition space? How do I react on specific artistic works? Am I allowed to touch that once or not? And you are offering, and I think it's generous possibility to putting your finger in.
And getting stuck.
Exactly. No, but I was also wondering, to go a step further with that intention. Is that for you a comment, or do you want to focus on the social impact claim, which art and its institutions are confronted with? That it has to be social in any sense, that there is this need, that work has to function social in a specific way, and at the same time this claim is formulated so strongly and also part of political context and so on. Is that something you want to thematize as well or focus on?
I consider every artwork and every institution as a functioning social, as a socially functioning, or let's say as a reason-giving object or place, and even if it's the most interaction refusing work, let's say the most classical also, still it creates a social interaction, not let's say physical but a mental. And I think every architecture is extremely dominant. It's like a bit like as a hidden structure. We often don't read. We often don't understand as something as dominant, and we mostly experience it physically. In that sense, we never experience it primarily like with our mind, or so. It's guiding us somehow. Mm-hmm. And I think art can do the same, or sculptures can do the same. And in that sense, I'm always a bit thrilled by, treating people also a bit physically, or by understanding sculpture also as something that works physically, not just visually or intellectually. So if anybody wants to have a drink, he's more or she's more than welcome. If somebody doesn't want to drink, that's completely fine. I would never put up a sign and say drink till you fall or so. That is, I think, the wrong approach.
I agree on that point. That in a way of for sure how work is positioned in space has an impact on the viewer, how the viewer behaves towards that work, and what you are also saying implicitly is that art in a way is in an indirect way social, I would say so. But nevertheless, it's this little slippery line when there is some kind of interaction you are offering. Yeah, so. It is not meant in that way. That's something I find very interesting. And what I wanted to ask with my social impact claim question is, you're going into this surroundings, into these spaces, making an institution running. In this sense, your artistic approach is coming from institutional critique. Yeah? At the same time, when you're now working with this idea of a social form, or commenting on that, it is, in my opinion, a question. Because I repeat myself now, but I think it is an important question for the art and institutions, how it is confronted with this idea that it should produce a social situation, and in that sense it was overtaking a political task, and by now it is actually asked from a political side that an art institution should work social in a specific way, or offer education programs and all that stuff, which is quite fine, but at the same time it became a claim. Yeah, so it's something you really have to, as an institution, also in some kind of artistic works, you're representing yourself above that. But is that something you wanted to comment on, or is it something you were not thinking about when you were doing that work?
No.
Okay. As no, you were not thinking about that. You didn't have that in mind.
No.
Okay. Good. Okay, then we have two more little questions actually left to talk about. One is more an impression of mine, because what I find interesting is that you're approaching an artwork from its limitations, from its question of space, from its also its materiality, or what it could contain as a container, at the same time from its social limitations. To me, it seems it's more about the question how an artwork is constituted. It's not firsthand about the space as an architecture, or, for instance, the materials itself. It's more about you're thematizing material, space, or social determinations to get closer to the question of how is an artwork constituted, received, and defined. Is that right?
Yes.
Is it more about the question of, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, then I have a last question.
That goes
Then,
fast.
but then you have to explain a bit more.
Yeah.
The last question is actually about something. It's temporary installation you're having here in Brussels at Établissement d'en face until October 20th. So just to give us a little view what's here around the corner and what this is about as a last question.
Apropos alcohol, what I forgot to say, I mean, like I did with a couple of other artists, but also sometimes, I think it was once alone, I did a bar sometimes in its most abstract way, but something, even these sculptures in the show and kiosk could be described as bars because they are object in a certain height and of a certain size, and there's alcohol on top, and it comes with light and ambience, etc. So, and art, which what Sin Taylor wrote so beautifully in the press text about this project is that art always came with bars, or bars were always there where art was made. And what I understood or what I learned from these projects is that sometimes, you know, if you call an artwork a bar, it also functions for somebody that is just coming for a drink. And but it also works for somebody that is coming to see, you know, whatever else idea is stuck inside. And this project is a project that I did that started from in 2015 with 3 artists. One is here, Robert Schwarz, Lukas Stopczynski and Andreas Bauer. It was during a residency in Los Angeles at the Max Schindler Center of Architecture and Art in Los Angeles, and you're put into a house which was built by Schindler, who is a student, who used to be a student of Adolf Loos, and you're offered a garage in the back that you're obliged to share with your colleagues that you haven't met before for half a year as a studio. And let's say 4 of us were stupid enough to immediately cancel their projects when we one night had the idea to, instead of using it as a studio, we could make a replica of the American Bar by Adolf Loos and put it into that garage. And that's what we did. And within a few months it became a Whitehall speakeasy in LA. In the beginning we invited 3 friends, and in the end it was 400. And that space is just 65% in height and in width, the same of the real bar, of the real American bar. So you can say the garage was exactly the same length like the American bar in Vienna, which is, I don't know if you guys know it, it's an outstanding piece of architecture by Adolf Loos. But in width and in height it was only 65%. So we understood this ratio, this scale ratio, as something which would apply on everything. So we applied it also on the materials that made out of marble. It was OSB was coming, out of wood it was cardboard, out of glass it was mosquito mesh, and out of leather upholstery it was air conditioned filter mats, and the pool noodle as a bar rail was also a bit of, like, let's say, an American 65% version of what it was. And in the end we brought this bar to the desert after it was running for a couple of months and got wilder and wilder. And there we created a Burning Man parody, the so-called Lost Bar Festival. Everybody that performed on this little stage that we had there played again, and in the end we burned it down, and that is the only focused photos of that night. And back then, somebody was there that invited us to do the same in Établissement en face in Brussels, but they immediately said, you gotta have the downstairs space. And we had that problem. I mean, you cannot bring the American bar to America and burn it down there and then show it in Europe again. That would be somehow a sad moment. And that's why we focused on the fact that we would show in the basement. And we looked what was underneath the basement of the American bar in Vienna. And apparently in the 1950s there was the first artist-run space in Vienna, the so-called Strohkoffer, which was a basement which was just covered with reed mats because it was the cheapest material back in the day, you know, in these traumatic post-war years. It functioned as the first space where, let's say, sculptors would sit on the piano and sing songs by writers, and painters that would be into abstraction would meet painters that would do figuration, and you know, they could all meet for the first time after being traumatized for all these years, and they started developing new formats. If a sculptor would play the piano and sing a song, then now you would call it a performance. Back in the day they didn't have the word yet. That's why we thought, alright, let's focus on that Strohkoffer and see what facts exist about it. Apparently not many facts exist because back in the day nobody gave a shit about documentation, and nobody, you know, made sketches of a basement that was just covered with reed mats. But there's a few interviews and a few stories, and by the end we had a list of, let's say, 15 hard facts. And then we thought, these 15 hard facts are so loose, we cannot just create our completely own version out of something which is, you know, hardly documented. So we thought maybe these 15 facts can be applied on the American bar upstairs. And in the end they did. Because in the basement in Strohkoffer they said there were 2 booths, it was always smoky, it was always hot, it was always packed, there was a piano, and you know, these kind of facts we put together and then said, alright, we do a Strohkoffer version of the American bar. And this is now in Établissement en face. Tomorrow is the last, no, not the last, one of the last Fridays, it's only tomorrow, and then on October 20th, it's the last night where the exhibition and the sculpture, which is in there, functions as a bar. And again, there's a stage which functions a bit as a plinth for, let's say, a local scene. And we always understood it as, let's say, a little platform where, call it customers or art viewers or exhibition visitors, could step on and also express or add themselves into this social form. The mathematic joke in this one is that this version of the American bar is 44% longer than the original one, but it's exactly the same width and exactly the same height. That ratio of plus 44% we apply on everything, so if you want to pass by tomorrow, you don't wonder that the music is slower, it's just pitched plus 44%, and the same ratio applies on various things, like our service is maybe a bit slow, the light is a bit lower, the materials also variations, and then there's a sad hour which starts at midnight, and it's the opposite of a happy hour, obviously. And so yeah, it's again a space that has dimensions, and these dimensions, or let's say the dominance of its architecture, is directly influencing the sculpture itself, and is transferred in every other aspect, like social elements, light, time, music, sound, air, humidity, smoke, everything. So you should come. It's only half an hour from here.
But shall we ask for questions?
Yes.
Other questions in general? Or we go to the exhibition space and see if some questions pop up there
While having a drink.
while having a drink.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah? Christoph, thanks so much.